I was thinking about wanting to talk about some of the early surveyors in the Lubbock area and the West Texas area and Lubbock in general, and some of the early monuments that were set. And I think when you do that, you have to start with looking at the topography of Lubbock to start with, which everybody knows the Lubbock County, everybody says it's flat as a pancake, which it's pretty flat, but I think most people would be surprised how much slope that you don't see. And Lubbock actually slopes, the county slopes from the southeast corner of the county to the northwest corner of the county, which the northwest corner of the county is about 400 feet higher than the southeast corner. Most people, I think, find that hard to believe. And then if you throw in the canyon, which goes across the county near the northwest corner of the county, you don't know you're in a canyon. You know you're a little lower than everything else, but in the southeast corner, Yellow House Canyon's about 3 miles wide and about 200 feet below the surrounding topography. So you're about 600 feet lower than the northwest corner of the county. And the canyon is a monument, if you want to call it that. It was where the original surveyors started, was near the center of the whole county is the southwest corner, section 1, block A, which the very first survey done in Lubbock County was section 1, block A, and it was presumably surveyed by George Spiller in 1877. And Spiller's field notes call for basically the junction of the two creeks that we have, which today generally don't have water in them, but there is the Yellow House Fork and the North Fork. Both of the Brazos come together just northeast of the main part of Lubbock. And Spiller called that to be 30 some odd miles west and 5 some odd miles south of a section corner in Crosby County in block 28 of the H&GN Railroad surveys. And you can go back and look at that one, that section, I believe it's section 37, block 28, had what they referred to the earliest surveyors as Dewey's Lake. And it was presumably a natural lake, although one of the other early surveyors that wrote quite a bit about his original surveying in Lubbock County was Oscar W. Williams, said it looked to him like it was created by a beaver dam. But it's on the White River, and it's like just a little bit east of Crosbyton. And that was in the H&GN Railroad surveys, one of a monument, a natural monument, which all of the surveyors should pay attention to natural monuments, is actually pretty much how they defined everything in the original surveyors. And I'm going to go back and start talking about the H&GN Railroad surveyors. Back in 1873, the H&GN, which was the Houston and Great Northern Railroad, laid a little over 100 miles of track somewhere in Texas. I'm not really sure where. But back in those days, the state was giving away land to the railroads to build railroads. And they were giving them 16 sections for every mile of track they laid. With that 16 sections, the railroads were supposed to go survey that land and survey a section for the state for every mile they surveyed. So with their 100 plus miles of track, they got somewhere over 1,000 sections of land that William Nelson was to survey in either 1873 or 1874. But William Nelson, along with Spiller and W.S. Mabry and several other surveyors that were surveying for the H&G in there, were all graduates of Virginia Military Institute, which has been referred to as the West Point of the South. And some of them had been Civil War veterans, but they were all pretty young. A couple of them were actually Civil War veterans from the Battle of Newmarket, which the VMI Corps of Cadets actually came out as a unit of students and fought in that battle, which is loosely portrayed in the John Wayne movie, The Horse Soldiers. But anyway, Nelson got the contract, and he brought Spiller and Mabry and Edmund Berkeley and R.H. Cousins, a couple other guys, and they came out into West Texas to start surveying a lot of these areas. And they surveyed from near the Oklahoma Panhandle all the way down into around Pecos. So they did a awful lot of surveys all in one year. But Spiller, who put a lot of his diary in one of the Texas Surveyors Association books, either A League to Each Win or $3 a Mile, has a pretty interesting part of his diary where he talks about they would go so many miles in a day and so did this, but he also talks about the crew and how they were equipped. And the survey crew that they had out there were 43 people in their survey crew. And I think 20-something of these 43 people were camp guards. And the reason they had 20-some-odd camp guards is because they were out, the Comanches were pretty much the rulers of the plains back in those days. This was still before Mackenzie had run the Indians off into, or got them in Palo Duro Canyon, killed all their horses, but they had 20-something camp guards. He has a list of the weapons that everybody had, and everybody's got a Winchester or Henry repeating rifle, which in those days was the top technology, if you want to look at it. So they got 43 guys out here surveying, and Spiller was in the Dickens, Crosby County area, and that's actually where they would do their connecting lines. And what they pretty much did was just what we would call a traverse. They would run random traverse lines and calculate their northings and eastings as they went. Well, Spiller says he would calculate it at night, so he would figure out where he was. But what they mainly did was traverse along the creeks and rivers and tie down the tributaries that came in, and if possibly there was a big tree that might happen to land near a corner, they would tie that down. But they basically created maps that showed the topography of the land and where they thought the sections were, and then they would take that back to the general land office and write their field notes, one set for the railroad and one set for the state, and the state would give title to the railroads for all the odd sections, basically, is what they did. Twitchell, another surveyor that most of us know about, and I might talk about him a little later, called this reconnaissance surveying, and said, this was all fine for mapping out property and transferring the title from the state to the railroads, but it didn't do anything for the landowners that wanted to, develop that land later. I have my own thoughts that if you look at a set of field notes from this particular point in time, if they call for a tree or a rock mound or something that is different, they probably actually set a corner there. If they call for an earth mound or a stake, it's on paper. It was, that corner was never set. But anyway, that is how the first, well, not the first surveys, but a lot of the railroad surveys got into the West Texas area. Now, Spiller and the H&GN guys never got into Lubbock County. Again, Spiller did do the field notes for Section 1 Block A, and in fact, Spiller did most of the field notes for the early surveys in Lubbock County. And by early, I mean, I believe it's 1877 were the first set of field notes. Interestingly enough, I'm not sure if it was maybe to make them a simultaneous conveyance, because simultaneous conveyance has legal repercussions, but Spiller did a whole lot of field notes in Lubbock County in 1877, and they're all dated the same day. I believe it's September 19th, but I'm not sure about that. But that would make any survey that he signed then a simultaneous conveyance, which makes pretty much the whole county one block. But anyway, Spiller did quite a few surveys that he did the notes on in 1877. And that was, but the actual surveyors, and I'm not sure who they all were, but one of them was O.W. Oscar Williams, who did a set, did his memoirs. It's called Pioneer Surveyor and Lawyer. And he was in the very first crew. That's also, a lot of his notes are in A League to Each Wind or $3 a Mile, I'm not sure which one. But he has a chapter in there that's from Dallas to Lubbock, where he talks about traveling, basically traveling from Dallas and then going to Dewey's Lake, which we talked about shortly before. And the surveyors that he was a crew of, they were actually, real estate developers, for the most part, that had somehow obtained a lot of certificates for sale to the state. They were also surveying some areas for somebody that was paying them to do it, but they took off from Dewey's Lake, and using that as a starting point, went up to what they thought was the Lubbock-Hale County line and set an earth mound there, they say. And in that case, I'm pretty sure they did set a real earth mound, because that was a monument that they were going to come back to and work off of for years to come. So then they traversed what they thought was the county line between Lubbock and Hale County, possibly doing a few side maneuvers to survey off some land in Hale County and possibly Lubbock County. But until they got to what we now call Blackwater Draw, but they called it the North Fork, because there were two draws that we spoke of that come into the center of Lubbock, one being Blackwater Draw and the other one Yellow House Draw. Well, when they came to Blackwater Draw, they erected a mound, Williams says, and then they started traversing the Blackwater Draw, headed south towards what became Lubbock. And they went through there and they mapped off Blackwater Draw, put crossing calls in a few places where they crossed the creek. And I say a few places because I have attempted to recreate some of their surveys based on the crossing calls in the creeks, and I've never been able to make sense out of them. There's not enough calls, and you build yourself a little map and you lay it on top of where the creek is, and it looks good over here, but you go a couple miles down the way and it doesn't look very good. But that was how they set up the first sets of field notes for the first sections in Lubbock County. And as they came down to the county, they came down 15 miles or so till they got to where the Yellow House Creek or Fork meets Blackwater Draw, and that is in what is today McKenzie Park. It's also the northeast corner of the section that contains downtown Lubbock. I believe that's section 1, block O. But after that, they did a few more surveys going on down the creek a little ways, but they basically wrote up all the field notes they had done, and they took them back. And George Spiller, who was the district surveyor of, I think it was the Young District, every district that the state had various districts for distributing the land, had their district surveyor, and their district surveyor had to sign the field notes. So all of the 1877 surveys that I've seen were signed by Spiller. And they took those in and started, distributing the land. But anyway, there still is not, other than a couple of dirt mounds, any monuments in Lubbock County in 1877. O.W. Williams again returns to Lubbock County in 1878, if I have my days right. And at that time, one of the people he's working for is named Gage. And whether or not Gage was a real estate developer or something, whether he was actually in Lubbock County, I don't know. But he signed a set of field notes for a section that was common with Section 1 Block A, and on his field notes they call for that to be a rock mound. And O.W. Williams does say in his memoirs and also in a map sent to the General Land Office that they had erected a rock mound so many varas south and so many varas west of the fork of the creeks. And that rock mound was the southwest corner of Section 1 Block A. So that was that first actual monument representing a section corner in Lubbock County. Then O.W. Williams says that they started traversing down the creek, which is now the Yellow House Canyon. The Blackwater Draw and Yellow House have come together, and they start traversing down the creek, and he says they're setting rock mounds basically along the creek every few miles. They get down to close to what's now Buffalo Springs Lake, and they're still setting them in the canyon. And there are a few of those monuments that I believe remain. We have found a few of them. They are today, you would have to be very observant to know it was a rock mound, but someone somewhere along the line, at least all the ones that we have found, have somebody stuck a pipe or a rod in the middle of the mound. So there may be a few rocks laying around a pipe, but there are some of O.W. Williams' original corners down in the canyon. And that's always interesting to find, you know, some of those really early monuments. And I'll go on to say, you know, O.W. Williams, he went on down to, he says, the junction of the Yellow House and Plum Creek, and they set a monument that was later used by W.D. Twitchell to build a lot of the later surveys in Lubbock County. But now I'm going to go back to Twitchell, because we were talking about how O.W. Williams and that bunch had come in and set the original corners in Lubbock County. Some of those remained, but then around in the early 1900s, they were having a lot of trouble trying to put the different section corners together, and that's when they started getting people like W.D. Twitchell and George Williams to resurvey a lot of the railroad surveys. And Twitchell came in, and all of the corners that I said we have found of O.W. Williams corners were previously found by Twitchell. I mean, Twitchell went in and rebuilt Block S off of some of Williams corners, you know, you can find in the 1900s where Twitchell calls for an old pile of stones, and he reset a stone or something where the old stones were. But then Twitchell also came back into Section 1 Block A to verify the stone mound that had been set by Gage, and tied a lot of that back into Crosby County and Lubbock County, and just a lot of those surveys. You know, Twitchell was the first surveyor. I don't know that he was the first, but around Lubbock, he and most of the Panhandle, I think, is given credit for sort of bringing surveyors out of the Stone Age, or the compass age, if you want to call it that. The early surveyors would use their compass and do their traverse lines, and again, as they say, that was fine for distributing the land to the railroads, but did not give property owners their corners. And so the later surveyors started depending on accuracy and trying to, I know they used transits as opposed to compasses. And Twitchell would use triangulation a lot. You can go miles if your baselines are correct, and have a lot more accuracy than using a compass and chaining the way they did. Anyway, after Twitchell, there came some of the later surveyors that we know about in Lubbock County, and probably the two main surveyors in Lubbock County would have been Sylvan Sanders and A.L. Harris. And Sylvan Sanders, I know, I believe Twitchell was his mentor. And Sylvan worked for the city of Lubbock for quite a few years, but Sylvan's parents were some of the original Lubbock County pioneers. In fact, his dad's name was Van Sanders, and Van was a rancher, cowboy, whatever. You can find his name on some of the early Lubbock surveys after the railroad gave out all those, and then later the state tried to let some of the individuals get some of the even sections, did some programs where they would distribute land fairly cheap for people that wanted to settle. And Van Sanders got some of that land. And then Sylvan's mother was Minnie Tubbs, who was Lubbock's first school teacher. And her father was named Isham Tubbs, another one of the early settlers, who built probably the oldest house still existing in Lubbock, out near 4th Street and Frankford, that he had brought the wood to build that house to Lubbock in a wagon, because the railroads did not come to Lubbock in those days. But Sylvan is a well-respected surveyor, as is A.L. Harris. We could talk a little bit about the XIT Ranch.
Okay.
Yeah, people around here know. I don't know if everybody knows, but do you know the XIT Ranch? Do you know what the XIT?
I know a little bit about it.
Yeah, the XIT. What was the XIT Ranch? Was the land that the state gave the state capital syndicate, a big corporation of sorts, that I believe was, I know they had a lot of people out of Illinois, because in fact the city of Farwell's named for a Farwell that was an Illinois senator, and that we'll get to that a little later. But I guess it was the 1880s is when Texas gave millions of acres to the state capital syndicate for building the Texas state capitol. And that became the XIT Ranch, and it goes basically from Hockley County, which is due west of Lubbock County, to Oklahoma. It's not all of that area, but it is a very, very big part of it. And some of the counties up there, like where Freona is and Hereford, I think are almost completely, Littlefield are almost completely within the XIT Ranch. And the XIT Ranch, the very original surveys, I believe, were done in 1859, I think. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I do know that somebody went out there and surveyed them well before they started the process of trying to get the state capitol built. And I think they did one of these things like they do today. When they got the state capitol built, they said, we need a state capitol. Somebody tell us what they'll do for us to build this capitol. So they kind of put it out for bid. At the same time, it wasn't necessarily a bid. It was, what can you do for us? Who's the best person to build our capitol? And it ended up being these people out of Illinois. But then a lot of that land had been surveyed earlier. And whenever they got ready to do the state, give the land or deed the land to the state capitol syndicate, along comes W.S. Mabry, who was another one of the H&G railroad surveyors. He was one of the guys that was over there surveying Dewey's Lake with Spiller. And Mabry ended up, for a while, he was in Tascosa, which people around here know Tascosa was the wild cow town up near Channing today, but it was that was the Oldham district that Mabry was the district surveyor for. But when they got ready to deed the land to the state capitol syndicate, the state capitol syndicate sent a guy named Babcock, I believe, down here to kind of look and see what land they thought they were getting. And this guy was somebody, he was very wealthy, and he had with him, basically he tried to bring all the comforts of home. He had a wagon, he had a cook. It was like something you might see out of the movies. But they took Mabry because Mabry was a well-known surveyor, and Mabry was like his guide to show him what land they were getting. So they, I guess they started out in Tascosa or wherever they started out, but they went up to find the northwest corner of Texas, which had been set, I think, in 1859, whenever somebody did the original surveys for what they call the state capitol leagues, which all of that land, at least as far as I know, all that land is divided into leagues and labors. A league is 5,000, well actually it was divided into leagues, not labors, but a league is 5,000 bears square. So if you look at a map of, I'll just say, where Littlefield is, Lamb County, almost all of Lamb County is leagues. I mean, and it doesn't take very many leagues to fill up a county. But anyway, they went up to what was supposed to be the northwest corner of Texas, and they started looking around. Mabry's looking around, and they find a big sandstone slab that's got, somebody's put marking on the side saying north 102 east or whatever. They've got longitude and latitude or something on there. And but he looks and he says, wait a minute, this isn't what's called for. What's called for is a 6-inch cedar post, 10 feet tall or something like that. So they say, this is not the right corner. We're going to keep looking. So they keep looking around and they find another corner about 2 miles to the west, and it is what's called for. In the original field notes that, like I said, I thought they were done in about 1859. So Mabry writes a letter and sends it off to someone and says there's some kind of discrepancy here as to where the northwest corner of Texas is. But so then they started basically touring the land that the state of Texas was planning on giving to the state capital syndicate to build the state capitol. And they moved back to the next row of leagues because there was a discrepancy in the west row of leagues. So they pretty much drove due south along the league line from Oklahoma to Levelland or wherever they were going. But and looked at the land, and the state capital syndicate said, yeah, most of this land looks good to us. And they had, the state said, if you don't want it, you can reject it. And they did reject a little bit of the land that they were supposed to get. But they were supposed to get an amount. So they could reject it here, and they were going to get some more over there. So, they weren't losing any land. But so anyway, there is still this discrepancy as to which corner is the correct corner. And what they figured out was the wood post that Mabry had correctly said is the one set by the Texas surveyors when they were surveying for the state capital leagues. Mabry said, that's the Texas corner. The other corner was set by some surveyors doing some surveying for the federal government or somebody to establish the southwest corner of the Oklahoma Panhandle, which presumably is the same corner, but they had two different corners about 2 miles apart. So the Illinois syndicate is sitting there thinking, okay, now what's going on here? Well, the corner that's farther east set by the federal surveyors or whoever surveyors, that would have taken away some land, so they thought, from them. So just as a matter of course, and now this is New Mexico at the time was not a state, so they really didn't have any say into where the border was. And the Illinois people thought, well, we're going to end up getting more land if we use that corner that's farther west. So they brought it up in the Farwell, who was a senator from Illinois, and there were some other members of the state capital syndicate that were government officials from Illinois, brought it up in the legislature, the Congress of the United States, that the wood post must be the correct corner. And basically by a voice vote, everybody in the Congress said, yep, that is the corner between Texas and New Mexico. Which you hear today where New Mexico says Texas stole a bunch of their property, and apparently they're right. I do find it kind of inspirational. That's what you always, supposedly the surveyor's mantra is follow in the footsteps of the original surveyor, even if he's wrong. but you know, they say he can't be wrong. In some ways that's true, some ways that's not true. I mean, you can't be wrong when you set the first monument, although if you set it 5 miles from where it's supposed to be, I suppose you probably can. But, you know, when you're following the original surveyors, you are supposed to, I mean, that's what you want to do. You want to figure out where they set their corner. That's more important than whether or not it checks exactly what they said. What's more important is to locate the corner where it was originally. But you know, a lot of these guys we really do look up to, and you know, they were doing things. It was a lot more difficult than it is for us. And again, when we go back to the H&G Inn guys, and they had 20 some odd camp guards. I mean, they were not just, you know, being accurate might not be the most important thing they were worried about, but they were doing, you know, they were doing what they were hired to do. They were doing it within the what was expected of them at the time. You know, things change, but a job's a job. You know, you've got so much time you're supposed to spend. But, you know, I go back, I keep mentioning Twitchell, W.D. Twitchell. In the Panhandle, I think West Texas is almost a Davy Crockett-like figure, at least among surveyors. Probably most people never heard of W.D. Twitchell, but we look at what he did, and I think he did bring us out of the Stone Age as far as the equipment they used and trying to do accurate, you know, really accurate surveys. Some of, you know, I've surveyed in following Twitchell, and sometimes you're amazed at the accuracy that they were getting. And Sylvan Sanders and W.J. Williams, two other guys that we just mentioned, for the most part, we find their surveys to be very accurate. They are tied to some kind of astronomical bearings. I'm not exactly sure how they got there, but when you read a lot of those field notes, Twitchell, on an awful lot of his field notes, you'll look there and he'll say bearings relative to sighting Polaris at some particular corner, and usually what would be an important corner, you know, sort of the original corner that they were using. So, you know, if you have those, the H&GN guys, not so much, but they were working off a compass. So they were, you know, however accurate they could get, you know, they were relative to north, and in some way. I've often wanted to learn how to run a compass. I don't know how. But yeah, there are people that say sometimes when we were talking about trying to follow the original surveyors, you might do a better job trying to follow them if you're using the same equipment they're using, because that might get you closer to where they were to start your search. And you know, that's I've never learned how to run a surveyor's compass. I wouldn't mind learning how to run a surveyor's compass. About the only other thing, I think earlier I was asked about whether or not I thought pursuing a surveying career is a good thing to do for a younger guy to think of. I don't think I said that. I do believe right now there's a shortage of surveyors in Texas and probably a lot of other places too. And a surveyor, there's a lot of, can pretty much write his own ticket, I think, today. And I think that's something people should think about. Now that might change. There's a lot of people doing stuff that used to be within a surveyor's purview. But right now there's a shortage, and I think, my dad used to tell me when I was going to school that he thought I should get my degree in petroleum engineering, because he always said that's a lot more money in that. Well, about the time I graduated, that's when one of those oil busts happened. And he told me he was glad I got it in civil engineering. It is what it is.
Yes, sir.
Which people say it is what it is a lot, over a lot of different things. And one of the main things you say is when you measure a distance, it is what it is.
Yes, sir.
That's a surveying term if there ever was one.